So tonight, I do want to talk about our understanding of who we are. I think it tends to be a little bit shabby, and so I think I can help in that respect. Just to better place the sort of anarchist spirit in history and help us understand where we're headed. You know, I enjoyed Dana's talk, didn't you, so much? Wasn't it so good? I have a quick story to tell you about something that she was talking about, how she went to Chuck E. Cheese and they wanted to see good report cards, and so she just made up a good report card and gave A+, you know, and got free. So I went one step further, actually. When my daughter turned 14, I had some sense that she was bored out of her mind and needed to go to college. So I just woke her up and said, hey, sweet girl, do you want to go to college? She goes, oh, sure, that's fine. So I put in an application. I had a problem. I didn't have any kind of transcript. So I just wrote one up, just wrote up a transcript, various things, and gave some A's and some B's or whatever, and sent it in. Well, it passed. It was no problem. She got in with no problem. But then when she turned 16, she had a problem because she had to get her driver's license, right? So one of the things that's required to get a driver's license is a high school. Oh, yeah, let's see, she wouldn't have graduated. So they wanted to see evidence that she had graduated. If you had graduated high school, they needed to see evidence of this. Well, she was in college already, so whatever. But they wanted to see a high school diploma. So I just Googled high school diploma and printed one out and signed it, And I gave it to the lady at the DMV. And she goes, okay. And then she said, wait a minute. This looks like it was signed by you. I said, yeah, that's sort of true. That's true. She goes, well, I can't accept it. I was like, oh, brother. So I left, went to the CVS and bought a bottle of Whiteout, and then went to the Burger King and ordered a hamburger. And I said, hey, listen, could you sign this real quickly? He goes, what is it? I said, it's a high school diploma. He goes, well, that's a little weird. But he signed it, right? Right? And then I took it back to the DMV, and I said, how about this? And they said, oh, yeah, sure, that works. So, So governments are a little bit stupid. Thank God for that, right? I mean, they're operating in decades-old technology. In fact, just the other day, I don't know why this always happens to me, but I end up in traffic court all the time. I seem to have a problem with authority, just in general. So the cop gave me a ticket one day for something. Of course, I didn't do. It's ridiculous, but I failed to pay it, inevitably. And so then I got a note that there could be a warrant out for my arrest. And I thought, okay, at this point, I have to get serious. In the end, there is a state. So I went to the traffic court, and you have to show up at 4 a.m. or something just to get in line, And you go to the office A, office B, office C, office D, and everywhere you go, you have to pick up a new piece of paper, and fill it out. And it's strange, it's like the ancient world, it might as well be 1403 or something, the way they do business there. So everywhere I'm carrying these papers from place to place to place to place, and so I finally get to see the judge, and he's got this huge stack of paper, and he's calling people up one at a time. I mean, the whole thing is like comical, and I'm there. A good part, nice people, but just a very old-fashioned, unimprovable system. It's like everybody knows it's ridiculous, but nobody seems to know what to do about it. Really, they're just sort of stuck in the 1980s. And so I got up to see the judge or something he gave me. But anyway, the person who came right before me, he had passed his sentence on or guilty or something. And he was one of these judges he's like a new judge, So he wants to pretend as if this is a consumer service. Okay, it's not service when they're robbing you, You could just forget it. There's nobody's being served here. Well, this is not free enterprise. So they're robbing everybody. But he says to her, listen, let me just ask you something. Is there a way, in light of your experience here, that we could have served you better? So she took the bait, So she hesitated. She goes, well, I don't know. I just have some sense of like, just throwing it out there. What if you had a system where I could have like signed up for a certain time slot, say 11:15, and just shown up to see you at that time, That could have saved me time, and it would have been awesome. And the judge just got furious with it. He goes, well, listen, ma'am, I don't know what you expect, but we're doing the best we can around here, all right? This is the system we have. And he started like blowing up at her. And so she was really alarmed by this. She goes, look, Your Honor, I'm so sorry, but you asked, And and he goes, all right, well, that's enough. All right, goodbye. You're dismissed. It's very angry. So I was the one right after. I knew not to do that. Anyway, I paid my fine and got out of there. Hey, at least I stayed out of jail, which for me is good. It's good. I have street cred because I've been to jail twice, How many of you you've been to jail? Wow, what a crowd. That's my kind of audience, right? That is so cool. All these jailbirds. Right? Wow. Yeah, that's really great. That's really wonderful. First time I went to jail, it was very alarming. Really shaken. And then the second time it was almost comical. At that point you're like, oh, you're doing the old handcuff thing. All right, drag me off to jail. The whole system is absurdly unjust. And the thing that strikes me about it is that everybody knows that. The jailers know it, the wardens know it, the judges know it, the bureaucrats know it. They're all sort of inhabiting this artificial fake universe where they know that it's unjust, that it's inefficient, that it's not necessary. They are very aware of it. Everybody's sort of waiting for history to make this change. From the era of statism and nationalism and fascism and socialism, something's going to trigger a change, and it's going to shift over into a new world of liberty. It could happen very slowly. In fact, I will argue today that it is already happening slowly, or it could happen very quickly overnight. I don't think any of us can really predict it, but this much I know. You are on the right side of history. The cool thing about everybody in this room, and I think this makes you very special, is that you have a consciousness of your own anarchism. Your consciousness of that you were born to be a free person, and you're aware of it. That makes you, kind of the 1% in a way. Not everybody understands this. And the second thing that's awesome, just by the fact that you're here, is that you have a passion to live this worldview. In fact, you can't really help it. You carry it around with you all the time. This love for freedom, and you try to find ways to be free in your life. And I would say those two things are the two things that are most essential to changing the world in a positive direction. You have to have that unity of theory and practice. Most people are actually themselves practicing anarchists, but what they lack is that intellectual consciousness and confidence that we could in fact live without the state, and should. If we had a just world with human rights, we would live in the absence of the state, as at least the state as we know it. So we're living in very artificial times. We've been through a century in which we have tried ghastly, horrifying, terrible experiments on human beings. And it's resulted in horrible things, and continues to. Whether you want to talk about gas chambers or gulags or poison gas or nuclear weapons or aerial bombings of populations, mass jailings, prohibition of anything and everything, censorship, religious controls over what you can do, everything from labor legislation to marriage laws, you name it. Most of these things, we need to be aware, are 20th century phenomena. If you were alive, think about it. If you were alive in 1880, in a sense that wasn't that long ago, certain things would be present in your life that you can't even imagine. For example, you were allowed to keep every bit of money that you made. If you made money, you could keep everything that you made. I know it sounds really strange, actually, But actually, in fact, by the 1870s, the 1880s, everybody understood that a state that took a portion of your income was in fact a slave state, and that the people within it were not free. I mean, I can cite the evidence here of Frederick Douglass, which, if you haven't read his history of his own biography, you definitely should. It's very interesting. But he talks about when he first became conscious of his own status as being a slave. What happened was that he had become very good at sort of bricklaying techniques. And he was so good that his master saw that there were certain advantages to farming him out to other people and letting somebody else pay them, and then the master would get the money. And this became a kind of he was in practice kind of free, because he could sort of come and go to go work for other people, and he did this for a very long time. And then one day he came back with all the money he had made through his own labors during that day, and came home in the evening and gave the money to his master, and his master peeled off, a few bucks to give to him out of gratitude of his heart, and kept the rest. And Frederick Douglass says, one day, this had been routine, had been going every day, but one day it suddenly occurred to him, wait a minute, I'm the one who did this work. If it weren't for my talents and my abilities, this money would have never been made. I made this wealth. It's right and just that I should be able to keep it all. And the fact that he can take this from me, and he has the legal right to beat the hell out of me if I don't give it up, is proof that I am a slave. And it was that consciousness that led him to plot his escape. So very interesting that not too many years later, America implemented an income tax, a universal imposition of the exact same status that Frederick Douglass had fled from. We pretended as if we got rid of slavery, but in fact, it wasn't too many years later when we implemented it. Another thing we didn't have in the 1880s was passports. How many of you have passports? You have passports? Yeah, okay. So it's good to have a passport, right? You need to escape, for whatever reason, I have a recurring nightmare. Do you have this nightmare, or is it just me? I always have this recurring nightmare that I'm on a trip, an international trip, and I don't have my passport. I suddenly am lost, I don't know why I have that nightmare all the time. But anyway, passports were implemented as a result of World War I. Before then, anybody could travel anywhere and do anything they wanted to do, and it wasn't even an issue. So, it's glorious. It's fantastic. Another thing we didn't have in the 1880s that we have now is labor legislation. Meaning that we have very strict rules on the conditions under which you could work. You can work. How many hours a week you can work, the hours during the day you can work, the conditions of employment, which is what in effect minimum wages do. These are all despotic laws. Child labor laws, which we've talked a lot today about children's rights. Child labor laws are a violation of human rights. They really are. Any child of any age should be free to work for wages under any conditions that the child himself or the parents agree to. And yet, since the 1930s, we've had these laws that you can't really work until you're 16, but even then you can't really work in a profession of your choosing until you're 18 years old, So of course, by this time, kids tend to lose interest in work, and they're already socialized in sort of the prison state of public school system. And we wonder what goes wrong, with kids when they graduate college, which are $100,000 of debt and have absolutely no skills whatsoever and can't find a job, and then they fall into depression and start taking drugs, and we're like, oh, well, this is weird. What's happened to our young people? Well, I'll tell you what's happened to them. Their rights have been violated, throughout the whole of their lives. They're used to it, and it's egregious and terrible. So we didn't have those in the 1880s. We didn't have compulsory education, which nobody wants to talk about any of these stuff. You notice candidates never raise this issue, compulsory education. It's the most important issue. It's basically the nationalization of children. That's really what compulsory education is. Force them into government holding tanks for as long as possible. Those didn't exist in the 1880s. Marriage licenses, what are we doing? What? You know, I mean, the idea that it's any of government's business, you know, what kind of relationship you have and the terms in which you have it. I mean, marriage in the United States had never been a state function at all until very late in the 19th century. So all these things changed at once. Over the course of the 20th century, and you know, this doesn't even get us into the whole area of price controls and, you know, New Deal style fascism, you know, the draft, you know, inconceivable in the past. We built in the course of the 20th century a ghastly prison state based on an ideological conviction that if we find the right people with the right amount of intelligence and with enough resources at their disposal, which they extract from the rest of the population, and give them massive firepower, that somehow this will magically translate into a better society than we would otherwise have if we're free. Okay, this, I submit to you, is a ghastly and terrible and stupid and unworkable plan. It didn't work for 100 years, and it's not going to work no matter how long we continue to try it. But if you think about it, the 20th century was a kind of a parenthesis in history. It was a reactionary stage. We had made so much progress from the late Middle Ages, all the way up to the age of laissez-faire, all the way up to World War I. And then almost overnight, we overthrew it all and adopted a different system. And it was catastrophic. But I think it is most likely going to be temporary. If you look at the sweep of history, it was a temporary period of reaction against the rise of laissez-faire, which had began as early as the 16th century, I would argue, even earlier, 15th century. The practice of freedom had begun really in the 15th century. The laws adapting themselves to the new freedom was adopted in the 16th century. Now, this movement that gave rise to the mass liberation of humanity from the structures of authority, which had always previously, in the previous, 150,000 years of history, always been a thing. There had always been a presumption that the tribal leader should be in charge, that the church should run things, that the state should run things, that the biggest bully should be in charge of society. That began to come into question fundamentally in the 16th century. It began with the question of religion. That was really the birth of liberty, the struggle over religion. That people, quite frankly, got fed up with it, just fed up with it. I mean, it started after the Reformation, right? There was this presumption after the Reformation, oh my God, what are we going to do? It's chaos. Two brands of Christianity competing, you know? What are we going to do? Well, one clearly has to win. And the one that would always win in every country was whatever happened to be the faith of the ruler, you know? So this became a special problem in England where it kept flipping back and forth, you know? You look at a guy like Henry VIII, you know, it was a very peculiar situation because he wanted to be a Catholic in every respect except for certain laws concerning marriage and divorce, right? So his brand of religion was very strange. He was implementing it, imposing it on the entire population. And then when his successor took over, very heavily influenced by more of a Protestant theory, implemented that and slaughtered the Catholics. Then when his successor took over, Queen Mary slaughtered the Protestants and promoted all the Catholics. And then when her successor came along, Elizabeth, you know, she slaughtered all the Catholics and imposed a new sort of quasi-Protestant regime. And so on it went until such a time as people said, you know what, this is stupid. What if we try a new kind of system? I know it sounds crazy, but what if we just do this? Let's let people believe whatever they want to believe and just see what happens. Let's just see what happens. No violence, just believe what you want to believe. And it turned out that it worked rather well. I mean, religious anarchy, actually, worked better than religious imposition and authoritarianism. And it was a beautiful thing. It was the first dawn of the glimmer of the beautiful Enlightenment ideology that was once called liberalism. Liberalism. Very beautiful word. Its roots in liberty, you can be free. It had iterations in every language. It was a global ideology, liberalismus, liberalisme, liberalism, libertad, you go through it. And we had a language that worked. And everyone began to gradually realize that through liberalism, we could live better lives together. We could have diversity. We could have even prosperity. Liberalism became very well connected with this idea of commercial freedom. People should have property rights, the freedom to trade. We didn't even need to bother with borders and nations with regard to trade. We could even trade across borders. Mercantilism began to decline. Freedom of speech, that was a big issue, You could say whatever you wanted. You even had the right to speak as you wanted. Nobody could hurt you if you weren't hurting anyone else. Pretty good idea. The freedom of the press. You could print what you want. You could even say heretical things and get away with it. And it was a beautiful ideology. Ultimately, by the 18th century, this ideology of liberalism came to be kind of codified in a new theory. And the theory, broadly stated, is this. Society contains within itself its capacity, the capacity for its own internal self-management. It's a nice idea that you don't need authority to tell you what to do. And the authority began to gradually slip away, ever more. And because there's always states around, and they're always trying to trick the population into giving them more money and more power. But through liberalism, we began to react against them and began to believe in this idea of universal human rights. Chaos as the source of order. That so long as you weren't hurting anyone else, no one else could hurt you. And it was beautiful. And it began to dawn, and it grew. And throughout the 19th century, by the end of the Napoleonic War, and by the way, along with liberal ideology also came a conviction that peace is always better than war. I mean, that wasn't always true. I mean, states for centuries had believed that war was productive and beautiful and challenged people to be heroic and courageous and all the rest of this blather. Liberal ideology began to celebrate peace and the building of prosperity just among all people as being a wonderful and beautiful thing. So, I'm telling you this story. Other aspects to liberalism that were just unthinkable. I mean, the elimination of slavery, right? I mean, we look at it now and go, slavery's bad. Of course you had to get rid of it. It wasn't always understood that you could have a society without slaves. I mean, somebody like if you read any of the classical writers, people like Aristotle, yes, we love Aristotle. Actually, on the slavery question, he really sucked. He was terrible, as were most of the ancient philosophers. They couldn't even imagine a society without slaves. In fact, it's incredible. You go from Aristotle and Plato and all their contemporaries, including some of my favorites from that period, Seneca and so on, all the way up, and also that Marcus Aurelius, which, I mean, I'm sorry if you love Marcus Aurelius, I can't do it. He's responsible for so much war and bloodshed. I don't want to read his meditations on morality. But anyway, I'm sorry if you love him, but he's just not my favorite. Maybe he's in heaven, I don't know. But all the way up to Thomas Carlyle, in the 1830s in Britain, the dominant view of the ruling class was to celebrate slavery as an essential part of the social order. I mean, it was true in the United States. It was true in Britain. It was true in many parts of Europe. Slavery was unquestioned reality. Like they thought that if you didn't have slavery, you would finally eliminate the final vestiges of social hierarchy. And then what are you going to do? It would be complete chaos. What? Anybody can start a business? Anybody can marry anybody? So we've already got everybody practicing every goddamn religion you want. I mean, that's chaos enough. We're going to eliminate slavery. I mean, we'll never be able to contain or control the world under those conditions. And Thomas Carlyle was a special. I have a special loathing of this asshole, actually. But do you know the phrase? Do you know the phrase dismal science? Have you heard that before? People are always describing economics as a dismal science. So Thomas Carlyle said that economics was a dismal science because these economists are always imagining that they could get rid of slavery and we could have a society of full equality and full freedom for everyone. He said that sounds absolutely dismal. So economics is the dismal science for this reason. That's why he called it the dismal science, because it imagined a world without slavery. Okay, one other huge contribution of liberalism. Okay, we've already been through like freedom of religion, we take it for granted, freedom of trade, the ability to socially advance in one generation, get rich, to build a middle class, to live long lives, make choices over what you do, what you wear. I mean, yeah, wow. That, I know, like we all wear whatever we want, right? I mean, I thank you for not judging me for my weird clothes, you know, that's great. But nowadays we just take it for granted that anybody has freedom to dress well. It wasn't always true. I mean, people are executed in 18th century France for wearing the wrong clothes. Because, you know, if you dressed above your station in life, it became chaos. It's hilarious, actually. Read 18th century British history and see how the working classes would start dressing up like the upper classes and just how much chaos that caused, you know. So we started taking this for granted. People can wear whatever they want. But I tell you, there was one final issue, and it was even after it came to be common to posit the possibility that we would eliminate slavery. And this is the most radical idea of all. The idea was first, as far as I know, advanced by John Stuart Mill in his great treatise, The Subjection of Women. This idea that women, quite possibly, should be considered to be normative human beings. I mean, it's worked. It's mostly worked. It's worked out mostly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's an amazing thing. Who did that? Again, it was liberalism. The idea is that women were not just simply to be passed as property from their fathers to their husbands, bear a sufficient number of children, and then thereby become expendable. And by the way, in those days, you know, in Adam Smith's time in the 18th century, typically 3 out of 5 kids died before the age of 2. So infant mortality was just part of the way the world worked. And I know in my own life, women who have lost children, even miscarriages, right, leave a deep sense of sadness in a woman's heart and affect a family forever. But especially the loss of a child, you know, before the age of 2. I mean, you never quite normalize after something like that. But just remember that before the age of liberalism, this is the universal human condition. If your kid lived, that was amazing. Death, it was just all around you all the time. We don't even know what this is like anymore. Infant mortality is down to virtually nothing. We take that for granted. But back in the day, death of children was just what you did. But anyway, so it was liberalism that first argued for the idea that women should be able to make choices about their lives. You have to kind of throw yourself back in time to imagine such a thing, that your daughter could just leave the homestead on her own, go to the city, get a cool job, live with other girls, whatever, make money for herself, and spend it on whatever she wanted to. I mean, that was an inconceivable idea, you know, in like 1810. But by 1870, 1880, it was the norm. It was the norm practice. Now, a lot of people were panicked about it, you know, especially eugenicists. You know, we can talk about the eugenics movement, which I think was actually the great fatal step in the history of modernity once eugenics ideology came along, which is just, you know, horrible. In fact, eugenics was the basis of a lot of the terrible things we're talking about: marriage licenses and labor regulations and so many immigration controls. All these things came about after eugenics period. But yeah, so the eugenicists were period. But for the most part, it was a very common belief by the late 19th century that quite possibly women, half the human race, should have the same rights as the other half of the human race. Who did this? What did this? What brought this about? What ended slavery? What liberated women from despotism? What broke down the hierarchies? What gave people the right to speak, to practice their religion, to write what they wanted to actually be free and to move and to advance? What did it? There was this beautiful ideology called liberalism. Always controversial, but always on the march, always making progress. And by the late 19th century, it had gained the moral high ground. We had become the mainstream of life. Now, when I say we, I really want you to understand what I mean here. I mean you and me. I mean all of us anarchists, because we are in that tradition. All right, most of us are like intellectually improved over, say, John Stuart Mill, or John Locke, or Frederick Bastiat, or Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we've got a more consistent view. Anarchism is the consistent outlook of liberalism completed. Nonetheless, you need to think of yourself as living as part of this very long tradition, dating back 500 years. You are part of the mainstream of life. I mean, why don't we believe this? Why don't we accept this? It's because the regime is always and everywhere trying to make you feel small and marginalized and strange and isolated. It's not true. And I don't think you should feel this way. And part of, I think, what we should be doing for us psychologically and mentally and intellectually is start to think of ourselves as part of this bigger tradition. So I want to call myself a liberal. I prefer the term anarchist, all right? But not everybody gets that. You know, if anybody asks me what I am, I'm a liberal. And I say that honestly and with great sincerity because my people, my tradition, brought the world out of the dark ages and brought to the whole of humanity enlightenment and learning and prosperity and health. That is what we have done. The tradition that you embody is that same tradition. That's who you are. You should think of yourself in this long process. So why don't we? I mean, why did this word leave us? Why is it that we feel awkward talking about ourselves as in the long tradition of liberalism? Well, that's a complicated story, but I will tell you this. Mostly it was achieved somewhere between something like 1920 and about, 1938 or something, like a very brief period of time when a bunch of neo-fascists and statists and quasi-socialists decided to take the term liberalism for themselves because it had such the moral high ground. They loved it so much. Basically, when we weren't looking, they stole it from us. So after World War II, a very interesting thing happened. There were a handful of genuine liberals extant in the world. One of my favorite is Max Eastman. He was a very cool guy. I mean, he was like a full-blown communist, in 1916, which back in those days, communist didn't always mean just nationalized property. Many of them were they were liberals that were confused about certain issues of economics. He certainly was one. And he went to actually Russia, saw that communism sucked, and then later came around to full-blown liberalist anarchism. But he, Leonard Read, Lawrence Fertig, Henry Hazlitt, you know that name, the guy who wrote Economics in One Lesson, a handful of other people, really probably fewer than 10 in the United States, in 1946, decided that they would do something about the problem. Well, what was the problem? Well, the problem was the war economy coming out of World War II. And this wasn't that long ago, okay? Look, here's what the greatest generation did, right? So-called massive food rationing. You couldn't buy food without a ticket from the government. Censorship, no book could be printed without approval from the government. The draft, you become a slave to kill and be killed was the norm. Society was locked down. I mean, it was tied down. It was a catastrophe by 1946, and yet everybody knew that the war was now ending. Something could change. This generation, a handful of intellectuals decided they would do something about it. And they started the Foundation for Economic Education, which I'm very honored to work there, actually. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to be the director of content for this thing. I don't know if you believe in ghosts, but I see their ghosts around me like every day I go into the office. Oh, good morning, ghost Leonard Reed, you know. It's creepy. I feel the burden of this all the time. But here's what they did. They had a problem because they didn't know what to call themselves. And they made a very interesting decision. By like 1953, everybody wanted to know what was this thing called Foundation for Economic Education. What do they believe in? And they wanted to call themselves liberals because that's what they were. That's what they believed in. But that word they thought was not available to them. So they began to kind of scour around the history of ideas. And they found this sort of word that had been languishing in the background, unused, that had mostly belonged to a small group of anarchists in the late 19th century who believed in free love. They were down on marriage and so on and so on. And they called themselves libertarians. And nobody alive then was using that term. So they decided to adopt it, right? They decided to acquiesce, give up the term liberalism, and adopt the term libertarianism. Well, the more I think about it, the more I think that it was a mistake, actually. And I'll tell you why for a number of reasons. It's not just because the word libertarian is very long and sort of hard to say and a little bit strange. And when you call yourself a libertarian to your friends, they're like, what exactly does that mean? I know it means you like pot, but is there anything else? You know. So it's, yeah, right. Oh, well, maybe that's it. It's fine. But I bought some candy today. I highly recommend it. But you know, the problem with the term, I think, is that there's a number of problems. Well, two big problems. Well, one is it's neologism, right? So we have to get used to this new word. And it's a little awkward. It makes it seem a little exotic. Instead of being part of the mainstream of life, you know, we suddenly think of ourselves as weird reptilian, you know, types, you know, or something. And it doesn't have any precedent around the world. Liberalism was a global movement. Anarchism of the sort that we believe in is necessarily against the nation state. We don't care about borders and states and everything else. We feel ourselves part of the brotherhood of man, as they used to say. So with the word libertarian, we suddenly lose our connection with our brothers and sisters around the world, all of whom would call themselves liberals. In fact, to this day, even in Canada, and certainly in Spain, and in Brazil, and to some extent, even in the UK, everybody knows what a liberal is. You believe in freedom of speech, freedom of commerce, freedom of movement, freedom of every fucking thing you think of, right? That's what liberalism means. But only in the U.S. We've lost this term. We have to call ourselves libertarians. So I kind of resent that. But another thing is, so it cuts us off internationally. But here's to me the key problem with the term. It cuts us off historically, so that we don't look back and feel an affinity with this great movement that was alive really from the middle of the 16th century all the way up to the present times. So we no longer, with the word libertarian, we suddenly don't have a sense of the sweep and the arc of history that's been gradually liberating humanity for half a millennia. Instead, we think of it as like this ideology that came to us like in the 1970s or something, you know, out of the revelation of Murray Rothbard or something like that, right? And Murray was a very dear friend. But Murray himself knew that he was nothing other than the newest iteration of liberalism. So I would like us to think of ourselves that way. And I think if we do, we can start to realize that we're not as weird as they say, actually. We're the real deal. And we have predecessors in history. And what we want for humanity is all the best stuff. All the things that belongs to humanity by right. Universal rights, opportunities for everyone without discrimination, for religion, race, language, gender identity, or anything else. We have the highest aspirations for our own lives and for the rest of humanity. Now I ask you, what is wrong with that? That's, to me, a very beautiful vision. I think it's something we should feel pride in. We want the whole of humanity to flourish. That's the whole of our ideal. That's it. It's not any more complicated than that. Okay, as liberals, what can we look forward to? And let me finish up here. I want to talk to you about this because, you know, we live in very interesting times, my friends. I am really glad that I can talk to you from this stage in 2017 rather than, say, 1987, where things looked really grim and terrible, or for God's sake, 1947. I think about that generation that started FEE. I mean, there was no hope whatsoever. And yet they did it anyway. They built a beautiful, beautiful ideology from the ground up at the darkest times of the 20th century. Here we are in the 21st century, surrounded by evidence that humanity is gradually being liberated from this monstrous beast of the 20th century that we call the state. And it's happening not because anybody in power wants it to happen, but rather because of you and me and the pressure that we're constantly putting on the powers that be. I mean, that's why marijuana is gradually being liberalized and legalized in this country. You don't think it's because anybody high in power decided that it should be this way, right? It comes about from revolutionary, persistent, unrelenting action from below. I mean, it's the people who are making this change. And so it is that the people will change the world in the future. I don't think it comes from the center. One of the regrettable things that I think have happened to the liberal movement or the anarchist movement over the last 10 years is we become too enraptured with politics, you know? There was a brief moment, you know, when my friend Ron Paul was running and, you know, a couple of, we thought, oh, maybe we can get our guy elected. Yeah, it was never a good idea. All right, it was never going to happen, and even if it had happened, I'm not sure we'd be any better off than we are today. Liberalism is always a movement from below. It's the people on the march, determined to be free. And one of the reasons I think a lot of us are sort of depressed all the time and not looking at the evidence of the successes around us is that we got too enraptured with national politics. And now you look at national politics and geez, right? It's just nonstop depression every day. I mean, it's frustrating for me. I've developed a news addiction over the last year. I think I'm going to have to break it. It's miserable. Do you watch the news? I mean, the news it's terrible, right? You know, everybody's, you know, oh, Fox says New York Times is fake news. New York Times says Fox is fake news. They're both fake news, you know? I mean, whatever. I'm tired of being inundated with this crap all the time, but particularly as regards national politics. Trump versus Sanders versus I don't know whoever's next, or that crazy woman from Massachusetts who imagines she's going to take over the Democrat. What's her name? She's terrible. Anyway, they're all terrible, and I'm sick of them. And they don't even matter anymore. They matter about as much as that judge who was shuffling papers around at traffic court the other day, and I'll tell you why. And this is a very interesting fact, and we can't forget it. In 2008, we had a massive financial crisis. You remember that? I mean, it was very interesting. House prices began to collapse like 10 to 20%. And instead of just watching house prices just fall a little bit, the entire, you know, financial and monetary order of the world, you know, was suddenly in question. I was talking to somebody the other day who was at one of the big firms, I think it was Lehman Brothers. I asked her, you know, what would have happened if the government hadn't bailed out the big investment banks? And she said, just flat out, they all would have collapsed down to the ground, without exception. They all would have just been wiped out. And it was her personal opinion that would have been better than what we have today, which is a very interesting point, but okay. So why did this happen? The problem is our technology over understanding who owned what, ownership rights technology, recording what belongs to whom, was so shabby in those days that once house prices began to collapse, nobody could keep track of who their mortgages belonged to, and it just became, you know, nonstop chaos. And it was that very year that we got the white paper from Satoshi Nakamoto, you know, that came out. I think it was something like November of 2008, right in the midst of all this nonsense. And what he proposed was a new technology. Now, what that later emerged as it was called Bitcoin, right? And it is called Bitcoin, and we all love Bitcoin. I carry Bitcoin. I bought my wonderful little hallucinogenic candies a little bit ago there with Bitcoin. It was all fun and everything. But in many ways, I think what we're going to discover over the coming years is that Bitcoin is just the sort of the headline event. The real substantive change that has affected the world is the invention of the blockchain itself, right? So, let me just kind of tell you what this blockchain is, just really quickly. The blockchain gives us the capacity to bundle together any kind of information bit in an immutable package and port it to any other node in the world or person in the world at very low price and almost instantaneously without any depreciation in the quality of information and without using any intermediary force, including banks or governments or any other third party. Okay, this is the killer app. It's the thing that will destroy power in the world today. It is. It's true. Now, how's it going to do this? Well, through gradual development. I mean, when I discovered Bitcoin, I thought, okay, this is fake. A couple of years later, I realized, no, it's real. And then my next thought was, why isn't the whole world using it and nothing else, right? Well, the thing is that history has to take, it has to march through the paces a little bit of time. But so much has changed. Over the last 2 years, blockchain technology has taken off to such an extent. It's now being used by institutions large and small all over the world to do things like process financial transactions, to registering property in Latin American countries and in the US, to registering marriages, to firing up smart contracts that don't require banks, not to mention the creation of a whole new class of assets, thousands of different new monies that were not created by the state. It's amazing. In the 19th century, they used to debate, does money come from the state or does it come from private markets? And nobody knew for sure. Now we know for sure. You can make a money, as a private individual. We've hacked the digital world thanks to the blockchain, thanks to the distributed cloud ledger. We now have the capacity to create artificial scarcity over a digital good that behaves better than money, better than gold, and God knows way better than any government currency on the planet Earth. And a great technology, we ultimately destroy a bad technology. Just give it time. History is on the march. If you ever doubt it, have a look at one of my favorite websites, Brave's New Coin, and look at the markets. There's many sites you can do this at. Look at the number of currencies. Look at their cash value. I mean, look at the 20th most highly capitalized cryptocurrency. If Bitcoin had been that valuable in 2009, the world would have been in hysteria. Now we just ignore it. We just consider it just part of life. And look at the number of applications being built on the Ethereum platform. Another cloud-based system. It lives off the blockchain, written in scripts. I mean, through Ethereum, and I hope there's going to be many other Ethereums besides just the one that's dominating application development today. You understand what's possible? Do you understand what this blockchain could do? We have the capacity now, conceptually, and in many ways, every day that goes by, more and more in reality, to create every form of government, small g, that we would ever need without the state. Any kind of thing we need to do as individuals or as communities, whether underneath this pavilion or anywhere in the world, is capable of being done through pure code in these distributed asset digital markets. It's unbelievable. We have the potential to generate anarchy out of code today. And we're doing it. We're doing it every day. Here's what's beautiful. We're doing it without anyone's permission. No one's asking permission. And it has got the SEC just about in hysterics right now. So people ask me all the time, what does government think about the blockchain technology? Well, I will tell you. About a year ago, a good friend of mine, I wish I could give you her name, I wish I could give you her firm, but I can't, sworn to secrecy, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, she was invited with some fellow friends in the blockchain industry to go to the Federal Reserve, to the Board of Governors, and present to them Bitcoin. So it was Janet Yellen's first exposure to Bitcoin. Can you imagine what kind of ivory tower she lives in? You know, it's amazing. So they're sitting around the Federal Reserve, and they pull up on a screen a website for a nonprofit, whatever it was, and then a broadcast of her smartphone. And she scans the QR code, pulls up her wallet, chooses a $10 contribution, makes it. Oh, and on a third screen they had the blockchain actually rolling. And then when the transaction went through, they froze the blockchain at that point and pointed to it and said, that's the transaction right now, and it just all happened. Janet Yellen nearly fell out of her seat. She didn't have far to fall, of course, because she's a tiny little woman. But she was in shock. And she was like, I don't understand. How did that happen? It's like, well, it happened through the blockchain. Well, but what are these Bitcoins and what's backing them? Well, what's backing them is the power of the service of information transmission through the blockchain itself. But that doesn't make any sense to me. Who's processing the transaction? What bank? What banks are involved with this? It's not being processed by any bank. It's being processed through a protocol that lives on the blockchain, a digital ledger in the cloud. She can't even begin to understand it. And so the entire board of governors of the Federal Reserve, this has never been written about, is just dumbfounded and in shock. So you see, you might think that they want to crack down on it, and probably to some extent they do. They keep trying to cram blockchain into sort of normal digital technologies, square pegs and round holes and all this kind of stuff. But mostly, I'll tell you what they feel. They feel outgunned, old-fashioned, stuck in the past, and they're terrified about it. They are. They are scared to death because the world is more obviously out of their control, than it ever has been before. When you go to sleep tonight, think about this. Remember that when you wake up in the morning, the world will be just that much freer thanks to this technology. That's a beautiful thing. The rest of our lives, we're going to be living through this iterative freedom, a little more, a little bit more. And there will come a time when we will wake up and we will be in charge. Not them, but us. And the world will tip in our favor. Just mark my words, it's true. And here's what I love about this so much. To me, this isn't about the imposition of an ideology. Your imposition of your ideology, your flag, your song, your uniform. It's not. What we're here to do is not impose anything on the world. We're here just to encourage the freedom of choice. That's it. Let people have their rights. Let them do peaceful things. Anything that's peaceful, let people do. This is not an ideology. It's not a plan. It's not a public policy. It's not a president. It's not anything other than human rights. It's an acquiescence to the true fact about the world, which is that ultimately, with humanity this big and a world this complicated and human mind so sophisticated and so creative and unrelentingly unpredictable, ultimately, no one can or will ever rule this world. Freedom must always and everywhere prevail. So I thank you for being an important part of this revolution. You have a job to do. You have been called to do it. And I thank you for letting me come to you and speak tonight. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Jeff? Another Jeff.
Yeah.
Mr. Tucker, I think that I loved your speech. It was great. I think you're a visionary, so I was hoping you could put on your visionary cap for a second and tell us what is the next steps? What can we do right now to take the next steps towards making a free society?
Right. So it all depends on where you are in life, really. I think the most important thing is to think about what you can do as an individual. I like small hacks in life. Like, I wrote an article recently called 5 Hacks for the Summer. Things you can do in your life. Just small things can make you realize that you're ultimately in charge, Like, like pulling out the flow stopper in your shower head, I think is actually, I know it sounds stupid, but actually it's the greatest thing in the world to have an unapproved shower. You know, I mean, it's just great. Right, yeah. There's a lot you can do in your own life. And I think these are important symbols because it makes you realize you can ultimately take charge of your life. And then you can start getting really, really creative. You know, be safe. Try not to go to jail as best you can. But there's a lot of things you can do. All of us probably should be taking more risks. You know, I'm not advocating, you know, being just outrageous and doing things you shouldn't do. But there's always ways you can help others. One practical thing I would love to see us all do. Anarchists, in my view, this is my view. I think anarchists ought to be the coolest, nicest, sweetest, most wonderful, generous people in the world. We are. Yeah, right? All right? We are. And the more we behave this way, I think it's good for us. We're making the world a better place. Touching people's lives and developing digital communities through love and affection for each other. Let's, you know, that I think it's just so important. You know, try to avoid flame wars as best you can. It's not good for your soul. You know, to argue, it's not just argument. I mean, just to flame people on Facebook and Twitter, it's actually ultimately injurious to you personally. Like keep your chin up and spread love, affection, generosity, and harmony in your own life as much as possible. In some ways, I think that's probably the best way we can bring down the state. You do need to understand something about the state, and this is true in all times and all places. The state is about social division. They want to create barriers between people and turn people against each other. You know, races, religions, sexes, age groups. The state is about dividing up humanity. So you can fight against that just by acting harmoniously in your own life. I think it's probably the most important first step you could take. Thank you. I haven't always done that, but I should. Right.
Yeah, it reminds me, I asked you how we can, you know, work with other people, and you gave me a really good answer similar to that a few years ago. I just think that, you know, anarchists really believe in other people.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're like crazy people who, you know, are real negative, but we really believe in other people. We believe that people can rule themselves. And I love what that blockchain thing. I haven't heard that message anywhere else. I heard it from you a few years ago, and
well, it's
I
getting
think
more
the
sophisticated
blockchain
every day. I mean, it's unbelievable. So here's one amazing cool thing about blockchain, and I didn't say this in my talk. But you know, a lot of the social order is determined by who has the money. You know, there was a huge shift in the world between about 1850 and about 1890 because of all the new technologies. A new class of people came to be in charge thanks to steel, railroads, telephone, flight. You know, all these new technologies came along, and along with that came a new class of billionaires, really 100 billionaires, mostly immigrants and people who came from very low birth, and they overthrew the old aristocracy. I mean, I would love to talk about this some other time, but and that generation definitely made sense. But this is happening in our own time. I mean, you need to understand this. We have a new class of multi-billionaires out there as a result of blockchain technology. They're mostly hiding right now, but they are there. And I'm telling you, it goes on every day. And I'll just tell you, and I don't know how much of this is going to be recorded or much less broadcast, but I'll just tell you a quick story. And if the person who's the subject of the story ever hears this, you know, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, okay, I'm sorry. But so this punk goes to work for me, and he just didn't have any skills, and he was just terrible, and he just got on my nerves, so I fired his ass, right? Sorry. Had to do it. So the guy, sitting at home depressed, decides to buy 5,000 of this ridiculous currency unit called Ether, which is now worth about 350 each. $350 each, right? So suddenly, he is now the same unskilled punk many times over a multimillionaire. All right, joke's on me. Yeah, sorry. But you know what? I'm happy about it. I think it's great. I mean, he's like 21 years old, you know? He just happened to buy the right thing. I mean, these technologies are giving birth to a new sort of crypto anarchy aristocracy. I mean, it's so great, right? I want these people to be richer than Rockefeller, you know, and all the old ruling class. I want the ruling class of yesterday to go to their death. I want them displaced, downtrodden, and ruined, and a new generation of crypto anarchists to come about where the balance of wealth is in their hands. You know, that's what I want to see, and it is happening. It's Nobody wants to talk about this, but it is happening. It is happening. It's a new global elite, and it's happening right now, and it's glorious. Woo, Ether! Yeah, yeah, Ether.
He's talking about the cryptocurrency, Jeff.
Yeah.
All right. Jeff?
Any other questions? Yeah, I had a long relationship with Murray Rothbard. If any of you are interested in that, you know, my old experience with Murray. You know, I met him in 1995, and you know, he was a tiny man. He's like this big or something, you know, and just laughing all the time. And I was terrified to meet him because I had read his books. Actually, let me go back. I was in college. And I became very intellectually curious, and I hanging around in the office of a professor of political science who ended up being something of a theocrat, you know, and one of these guys always telling me about the sovereignty of God or whatever. And I found it interesting, but I was sitting in his office and I said, hey, what's that book? It was the book called Man, Economy, and State, and it was huge. And I thought, well, I'm interested in those three things. So, you know, should I read that book? He said, oh, no, whatever you do, don't read that book. Murray Rothbard is an anarchist. So I said, okay, thanks for that advice. Listen, I need to be going now. And so I immediately went to the library. What's the first book I checked out, right? So I read the whole thing. I was all in, you know. But then I was very sweet to actually meet him years later, and we struck up a really good friendship, and we were very close for many years. He delighted me just unrelentingly. He gave me several of his bow ties, which I keep now. I love him. I loved him very dearly. A wild man. And I remember when I first got to know him, he used to embarrass me slightly because he'd say things that I thought shouldn't be said in public, you know. We were walking along and he said, Jeffrey, you know, this whole drunk driving thing, you know, the state shouldn't make it illegal for your blood type to be a certain thing or not a thing. That's not a crime to have a certain blood type. Drunk driving should be completely legal. And I remember being sort of young and a little bit, you know, wanting, you know, sort of respectable thoughts. And I remember thinking, Murray, Jesus Christ, please never write that opinion publicly. I mean, that's just mortifying. You'll just totally discredit yourself. But actually, it blew my mind. And I began to think about it for years. And I later, years after his death, wrote an article called Legalize Drunk Driving. You know, so, you know, I mean, you know. Sometimes you have to hear the uncomfortable truth. You know, you have to hear the shocking things. So this is why I like to say as many shocking things as possible, and I do. You know, I wrote an article. The Washington Post came out with an article. Where's Dana? She's not here. Washington Post ran an article a couple years ago, talking about the horrors of child labor in the early part of the 20th century, and they had all these kids kind of wearing like sort of rough suits, you know, smoking cigarettes, you know, they're just getting off their paper delivery or coming out of the coal mines or whatever. They all look kind of awesome to me. I was like, poof, look a lot better than these poor kids in public school all Adderalled up and, you know, sitting there dreary. And you know, these kids are like kind of in charge, you know. So I wrote an article, I said to somebody, like, let the kids work. Look at these awesome kids. And I ran the same photo montage and did a commentary. I said, look at this girl's eyes. I mean, she's just, you know, owning the world, man. This kid's like on top of things. You know, this is just great. What do you want them in compulsory, you know, public schools in cages, sitting in chairs, listening to some blathering idiot, you know, tell them to memorize dates? I mean, you know, you think that's a better life? Anyway, so it was retweeted by a person I had never met, but is a very big activist for school choice, I think in Michigan, right? And so when Trump became president, he probably, I don't know why, but he tapped her to be the Secretary of Education. And right, what's her name? I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, Devon. Right, Betsy. Betsy retweeted my article. So at her hearing, it became an issue. It became an issue that she had retweeted my article. And she was asked, is it your plan to abolish public schools and put all the children to work in coal mines? So she got in trouble for retweeting my article, yeah. She didn't back down. Yeah.
Not yet.
No, yeah, right. Anyway, so Murray, yeah, she'll back down. They all back down. But Murray was a very interesting guy, and we hung out a lot, and drank a lot. Went to a lot of movies together and theater. He was very interesting. He's one of these guys. He would never preach to you. Like as an individual when you would hang out with him, he wasn't telling you what to think. You know what he was doing? It was actually kind of weird. Murray would suck information out of your brain, like whatever you knew. Like there's a guy earlier who knows everything about blacksmithing. If I were Murray Rothbard, Murray would have just cornered the guy in the back of the room and extracted every bit of information about blacksmithing that he possibly could until the guy was completely like mentally dry. And then Murray would say, "Wow, thank you very much," and move on to the next person. That's what he did. He would get every bit. He would suck your brain dry of information. He was like a sponge, just desperate for information. He wanted to know everything you knew. So you try to ask him a question, he'd say, "Well, tell me what you know." That's just the way his temperament was. So I missed him. He died in 1995, and he's irreplaceable. It was that same year that the web browser came along, and the internet really became mature. And I just think God created the internet because we had to do something to replace Murray. That's all. So, anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Huh? One more.
Go ahead.
Hey, one quick question. We're having an anarchy ball tonight, and are you aware, or you know the story? I'd heard a story that Rothbard's parents met at an anarchy ball in like the 20s or something.
I've heard that before. Murray's father was never an anarchist. He was a kind of a conservative. They were Russian Jewish immigrants, Ashkenazi, from the 1880s, 1890s, and they lived through a hell of a thing. In this country, long before Hitler ever thought about exterminating the Jews, the ruling class in America tried to exterminate the Jews also. This was in the 1890s and 1900 through eugenics. There was a tremendous cultural-wide panic that our women, so-called, would marry into the Jewish race and corrupt the American race. If you ever want to read about eugenics, you'll never read anything more horrifying and terrifying. It was like a universal ruling class ideology at the time. So his parents were subjected to this. But Murray himself became an anarchist very late in life. Late in life. He was probably in his early 20s, and came to be convinced by another Jewish immigrant, because Murray's father was not an anarchist. Murray was convinced of anarchism by this great writer named Frank Chodorow. He was a good friend of his in New York and convinced Murray to be an anarchist. It's always the Jews. The Jews always have the coolest, newest ideas. And Murray became an anarchist. He hung around with Ayn Rand for years. But, and twice, he entered into her little circle and then left and then came back again. And both times he felt himself sort of excluded because, Ayn was a genius, right? But she also knew everything. And he didn't feel like there was any room for him to think around her because her sort of steely-eyed, gaze and her all-night, salon and everything, and he broke away from her and started his own salon. But in many ways, he was so much influenced by her too. Does anybody consider themselves like a follower of Ayn Rand here at all? I mean, okay, yeah, but she's a little bit sort of not as fashionable as she should be. I'm personally really I obviously can't agree with her on everything, but I think she's very good to read because she builds into her ideology a strong personal motivation. You read her and you feel more powerful as a person, and that's a very good thing, I think. Murray read her and it changed his life, actually.
Go-to straw man for the left, though.
She's a caricature, but I think one of the most impressive things about Rand is when you realize, number one, that this is a person for whom English was not her first language.
Yeah.
I mean, she spoke with a Russian accent. She grew up in Russia, but I think when you consider what she actually came out of, that she was able to go as far as she did and make that philosophical contribution is astounding.
Astounding. And that also helps explain sometimes her awkward use of language, that she could never really understand why people were reacting so strongly against her. Like she would write, selfishness is a virtue. And people would say, that's the most horrible thing I've ever heard. But from her point of view, selfishness just meant to be self-regarding, to care about your own life, primarily. So, yeah.
Even out of charity, you're still doing it out of your own self.
That's, right. Right. I did. She. Right. Yeah, me too. Right. I mean, when I was in high school, I remember I read one of her books, and then she sort of makes you feel like you're a philosopher or something. And I remember going out on sort of those awkward high school dates, where you try to get to first base or something, and trying to impress chicks with Randian language. It almost. It didn't work? No. Well, that explains my life. It didn't work. It doesn't work, right? Now they call it mansplaining. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you tonight.
Thank you, Jeff.